You know that feeling when a totally random, offhand comment from a coworker just absolutely derails your entire day? Well, let's get right into it. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating journey. We're starting at the absolute microscopic level of human biology and going all the way out into this massive, cosmic, theological worldview. Based on our source text today, we're exploring a super unique framework focused entirely on how our brain chemicals dictate our emotions and, more importantly, how those very emotions go on to construct the reality, the relationships, and even the spiritual battles we deal with every single day. So if you've ever been curious about how biological impulses scale up into complex psychological games, you are absolutely in the right place.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the chemistry of emotion. 2, stimulus and human interaction. 3, the boundaries of the system. 4, emotional projections and games. And finally, number 5, the spiritual realm's defense. Let's get to it.
Okay, Section 1, the chemistry of emotion. The foundational premise from the source here is that the universe itself is entirely neutral. Like God or the ultimate observer views the universe in a completely neutral way. But for us humans, well, our internal brain chemicals essentially act as the baseline filter for absolutely everything we perceive. The text makes this wild argument that if these chemicals aren't present, the brain is really just a passive storage drive. But when those chemicals are there, they completely dictate how our neurons fire. That means a completely neutral piece of information can be perceived as entirely good or entirely evil, literally depending on the chemical state of your brain at that exact fraction of a second. Meaning that stressful email you just read, it might actually be completely neutral. It's just your brain chemistry painting it as a massive threat.
So the source actually outlines this very specific biological chain reaction. Step 1, we have the presence of the chemicals. Step 2, this forces the neuron firing patterns to occur in a specific direction. Step 3, this chemical firing generates an emotion. And finally, step 4, and honestly, this is where it gets really interesting, the source argues that these chemically generated emotions actually become the fuel for our logic. They literally form the base of our judgment and our decision-making process. Think about that. Your learning, your logic, all your choices, they are all entirely downstream from that initial chemical release.
Moving on to Section 2, stimulus and human interaction. 2. 2 is the magic number where the universe suddenly opens up to friction. The text explains that every single individual is walking around with programmed, learned patterns of behavior. But the moment two human beings occupy the same space, an impulsive, what the author calls an accidental stimulus, inevitably enters that space between them. Someone reacts. And in that split second, sensory information is transmitted and received, and boom. An inner psychological war can ignite simply because two highly conditioned chemical systems are suddenly forced to interact. It's kind of like that sudden blinding flash of road rage you get when another driver cuts you off, right?
So when that interaction happens, the text says it generally goes one of two ways. On one hand, you get an unstable relationship. This is when those neutral stimuli are filtered poorly by the brain's chemicals, and they morph into hatred, envy, and basically a psychological war. It's a total collision of negative program behaviors. But, on the other hand, we have a stable relationship. The text posits that when a relationship is driven by love, everything falls in the right direction. That chemical filtering creates a stable system where sensory information is actually processed harmoniously.
Right, on to Section 3, the boundaries of the system. At this point, the text introduces a really compelling concept simply called the system. The author treats the spaces we inhabit almost like a controlled laboratory or, say, a classroom. A system is ultimately defined by its boundaries. Inside these physical and temporal boundaries, human personalities live, they transact with one another, sending and receiving all those chemical and emotional inputs, and they learn. Just think about your own office or even your living room. Every single environment is a closed system with a finite number of these transactions happening at any given second. Now here is where the source takes a fascinating, almost sci-fi kind of turn. It describes humans as time travelers who have been placed into these situational systems. According to the text, you are essentially a time traveler moving through space and time, downloading information and simulating it in your mind. And as a time traveler, you have to fight to change your space, to navigate these different subjects of the universe and ultimately progress your life forward, all despite the constant friction from others inside the system.
Which brings us to Section 4, emotional projections and games.
As we've seen, when two distinct human universes collide, the transactions aren't always exactly peaceful. The source identifies specific states of interaction that can happen when someone acting as a persecutor introduces negative emotions into the system.
This persecution can manifest as a physical action or written action, but dangerously, it leads to very tangible injuries. And we're not just talking physical injuries here, but deep psychological injuries. Hatred and envy are projected from one person directly onto another, basically forcing the receiving mind to act and react just to defend itself.
The text describes this persecution as a sort of psychological trap. These persecutors project emotional information to basically drag the time traveler into what the author calls a dead space, or a negative game. The underlying message of all their transactions is essentially, hello, look at me, play the game, right? They are aggressively trying to divert your focus. And since time and focus are literally the most precious things a time traveler has to actually achieve their dreams, getting dragged into these emotional games is incredibly destructive. It literally robs you of the time you need to achieve your own goals.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the spiritual realm's defense. Here, the source zooms way out and categorizes existence into an ultimate dichotomy. On one side, you have the physical realm of consciousness. This is the realm of those accidental stimuli, manipulative games, and psychological injury. But on the other side is the spiritual realm, and the text asserts that this spiritual realm was actually the origin of the physical world, characterized by pure love, guidance, and peace.
So, to bridge the gap between these two realms, the text details a very specific theological assertion. It introduces the concept of an ultimate observer, identified here as the Holy Spirit. According to the author, when a human being is trapped in an unstable system with a persecutor, and they realize they just cannot win that psychological game, they have the option to surrender. By raising their conscience and appealing to this higher observer, the text states that the Holy Spirit acts as a witness and a guide, essentially helping to rescue the individual and fine-tune their personality so they can find balance and survive that intense emotional manipulation.
So what's the takeaway? The crucial point is how the source proposes we can actually counteract all this emotional manipulation and reduce those psychological injuries. The text argues that you can actually alter your predestined behavioral patterns through a few very specific actions. First, simply stop responding. If you ignore the negative projections, the chemical reaction stops and the game just ends. Second, deliberately raise your consciousness from those physical transactions up to spiritual ones. Third, actively try to attract love. And finally, program your own universe, meaning your own mind, with powerful positive words, which the author specifically identifies as the teachings of the gospel.
Which brings us to our final thought. We started this explainer looking at microscopic brain chemicals that blindly react to external triggers, generating these powerful emotions that can drag us into some pretty destructive games. But the source leaves us with a profound challenge about taking control of both our biological and spiritual destiny. Will you allow every accidental external stimulus to dictate your brain's chemistry and your emotions? Or are you going to take the reins, raise your consciousness, and actively program your own universe? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to think on that.